The sun beat down on Maplewood Lane, a street so perfect it could have been a movie set. Every lawn was a seamless carpet of green, every mailbox stood at the same angle, and every house was painted in one of the 3 approved neutral colors. At the center of it all was a tiny, charming rebellion, the garden of George Miller. At 73, George was a man of simple pleasures. He was a retired history teacher who found his peace not in ancient texts, but in the vibrant chaos of a front yard bursting with life. Unlike the sterile lawns of his neighbors, George's garden was a masterpiece of color, a riot of fuchsia petunias, golden marigolds, and scarlet poppies. He was kneeling, his hands caked with rich soil, humming a forgotten tune as he gently pulled a stubborn weed from the earth. He loved this patch of land more than anything. It was a vibrant canvas for the quiet artist he had become. Across the street, on her own porch, Brenda watched him. Brenda was the president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association, or the HOA, as it was known. She was a woman for whom rules were not suggestions, but sacred law. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored black pants, she held a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Her own front yard was a testament to her principles, a flawless, geometric expanse of emerald lawn, utterly devoid of any plants that might dare to bloom or stray from the perfectly defined borders. She had been observing George for weeks. First, it was the rogue petunias that had dared to grow 6 inches higher than the approved 4-inch limit. Then, it was the unruly wisteria vine, creeping ever so slightly over the fence line. Brenda had sent emails, warnings, and even a formal letter, all of which George had politely ignored. Now, her patience had run out. She saw this as an attack on the very fabric of their community. With a tight-lipped grimace, she pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the keypad. "He's left me no choice," she muttered to herself, her voice a low, angry hum. The dial tone rang, and a calm, disembodied voice answered from the 911 dispatch office. Brenda's voice, usually so clipped and precise, became sharp and frantic. "I need an officer to 4503 Maplewood Lane immediately," she demanded. "There's a public safety hazard. A neighbor is in direct violation of community bylaws. The overgrown foliage is blocking the view of the street, and it's a potential fire risk." The dispatcher, a tired-sounding woman who had heard every kind of complaint, tried to reason with her. "Ma'am, that sounds like a civil matter, not an emergency." Brenda's voice rose to a near scream. "This is an emergency. He's a menace. If you don't send someone, I'll be forced to file a formal complaint with your department's internal affairs." The dispatcher sighed, knowing that arguing was a losing battle. "All right, ma'am, we'll send a unit. Please remain calm." A few minutes later, the distinct, low thrum of a patrol car engine filled the quiet street. The cruiser rolled to a stop in front of George's house. Brenda watched from her porch, her arms crossed, a smug smirk on her face. George, who had been humming to his poppies, straightened up, a look of utter confusion on his face. To officers, Officer Jenkins and Officer Davis approached his garden gate. "Mr. Miller," Officer Jenkins asked, his tone cautious. "We've received a complaint about a landscaping violation." George let out a small, quiet laugh. He gestured to his flowers with a dirt-stained hand. "My petunias." "I apologize, officer, but I wasn't aware they were a menace to society." Officer Davis, a younger, more jaded man, tried to suppress a smile. "We were told they were a fire hazard." "Sir," George's chuckle turned into a full-blown laugh. "The only fire hazard here is the passion with which Brenda across the street takes her job." The officers, seeing the harmless nature of the situation, began to back away. "We'll just file our report, sir. Nothing to worry about." Just then, Brenda, seeing her plan failing, strode across the street, her face contorted in a mask of fury. "You're just going to let him get away with it?" She snarled at the officers. "I've sent him dozens of notices. He's in direct violation of every article in the HOA handbook. This man is a walking disaster." As she ranted, Officer Jenkins' eyes idly drifted towards George's house. In the front window, partially obscured by a dusty, old curtain, he caught a glimpse of something strange, a small, black box with a series of blinking lights. It was an anachronistic piece of technology that looked completely out of place in George's quaint home. Jenkins dismissed it, assuming it was some old ham radio, and turned back to Brenda, offering a final, polite refusal. Brenda's fury reached its boiling point. "Fine, if you won't do your job, I will." She pulled out her phone, switched on the video recorder, and began to yell directly at George, detailing his endless violations in a desperate attempt to create a viral video. George simply smiled, gave a small shrug to the officers, and walked back into his house, closing the door behind him. Brenda, frustrated and fuming, kept recording. She moved closer to the house, trying to get a better shot of the offending petunias, but as she did, her foot caught on a loose paving stone. She stumbled forward, grabbing the window frame to regain her balance. The old, rotting wood gave way with a soft creak. She peered through the gap she had just created, and what she saw sent a gasp to her lips. In the dim, dusty room, she saw a large, wooden crate covered with a tarp. A corner of the tarp was pulled back, revealing a single, gleaming metal object. It looked like an old, ornate box, and it was attached to the very same black box with the blinking lights. Brenda, forgetting her anger and her video, took a shaky picture. The moment Brenda peered through George's window and saw the strange contraption, the blinking black box, and the ancient-looking metal object, her petty fury vanished, replaced by a consuming, intoxicating curiosity. She immediately forgot about the offending petunias and the HOA bylaws. Her mind, so long occupied with mundane regulations, was now racing with possibilities. The object looked like a safe, but not a modern one. It was ornate, with a kind of craftsmanship she'd only ever seen in museums. Brenda, driven by a new, powerful obsession, returned to her house, her fingers trembling as she uploaded the shaky photo to her laptop. She spent the entire night doing reverse image searches and digging through archives of antique dealers and rare collections, but found nothing. The object was a ghost, a mystery that gnawed at her, and the more she searched, the more she was convinced that Grandpa George, the simple gardener, was hiding something of immense value. Meanwhile, for George, the day's trivial incident had a far more serious consequence. While the two officers had been amused by Brenda's complaint, Officer Jenkins, the more observant of the two, had filed a mandatory, if minor, report. In the comments section, he had idly noted the unusual electronic device he'd seen in the window, a small detail that seemed harmless at the time. What Officer Jenkins didn't know was that George's house was on a list, a dormant one, but a list nonetheless of properties once owned by members of a highly specialized and now defunct government agency. The report, a simple data entry, triggered a low-priority flag in a remote federal database. It was a digital ghost from the past, an alert that whispered of a forgotten secret. For 30 years, George had lived a life of quiet anonymity, believing he had outrun his past. He had constructed his simple life as a shield, but Brenda's call had just created the first crack. George, oblivious to the bureaucratic wheels turning in the distance, felt a different kind of anxiety. He saw Brenda watching him, not with her usual disapproving scowl, but with a predatory intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He saw her staring at his window, her eyes fixed on the very spot where his most precious possession was hidden. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He knew she had seen something. That night, he moved the black box and the ornate safe to the cellar, covering the entrance with a heavy rug and a stack of old magazines. He went to bed that night not with the peaceful satisfaction of a gardener, but with the gnawing paranoia of a man on the run. Brenda, fueled by her suspicion, began her campaign in earnest. No longer was she content with just passive-aggressive notes. The next morning, shepherded out her shaky photo, drew a red circle around the black box, and filed a formal complaint with the city's zoning and safety department, claiming George was operating an unlicensed, unapproved device that was emitting unusual electronic signals. When the city inspector came, George met him at the door with a warm smile, explaining that the device was just an old radio that hadn't worked in years. The inspector, a friendly man named Roger, found the complaint ridiculous and left without incident, but Brenda didn't stop. She next filed a complaint with the county's health department, claiming George's garden was attracting invasive species and rodents, even though the only animal anyone had ever seen in his yard was a harmless stray cat. Each complaint was a legitimate piece of paperwork, a tiny stone she was throwing at George's house, hoping one of them would break the window and expose what was inside. Her obsession was no longer about rules. It was about the thrill of the hunt and the possibility of a payoff that could change her life. She started to use the HOAS email list to send out community alerts about George, twisting his actions to make him sound like a criminal. She even hired a private investigator to do a quick background check on him, telling the investigator she was concerned about his unconventional behavior. Unbeknownst to them both, the silent flag on George's file had been noticed. An analyst in a federal office, intrigued by the combination of the mundane landscaping report and the mention of the unusual tech, ran across reference. The name George Miller came up on a very short list of individuals with a unique, classified past. A team was dispatched to quietly investigate the landscaping complaint, not to enforce city ordinances, but to determine if the retired history teacher was the man they thought he was. George, sitting in his living room, felt the world closing in on him. He saw Brenda's new car, a black sedan, parked down the street for hours at a time, its windows tinted. He was sure it was her. He had lived a life of peace for so long that he had grown complacent, and now the quiet danger he had so carefully avoided was knocking on his door. He had only a few days before his secret would be exposed, not by the police or by the HOA, but by the very history he had tried so desperately to bury. He looked at the sealed envelope on his coffee table, the one that contained the true answer to the $2 million question. He knew what he had to do next, but it was a decision that would either save him or cost him everything. Brenda, in her blind rage and newfound greed, had just opened the most dangerous door in his life. Brenda, her mind now a relentless engine of speculation, had given up on mundane HOA violations. She was now a woman with a mission, her every waking moment consumed by the mystery of George's hidden object. She had posted her blurry photo on various community forums and even sent it to a local news station, tagging it with the headline, HOA President Uncovers Suspicious Device. The post went viral in a small, local way, catching the eye of a young, ambitious investigative reporter named Alex, who worked for a digital news outlet. Alex was tired of covering city council meetings and local bake sales. He saw Brenda's outrage as the perfect hook for a clickbait story. Neighborhood war explodes over a mysterious black box. He reached out to Brenda, expecting to find a typical Karen, but what he found was something far more compelling. She was not just angry. She was consumed by a righteous obsession, her eyes wild with a fire that went beyond mere landscaping. She showed him the photo, her hands shaking as she described the ancient-looking safe and the blinking lights. Alex's journalistic instincts told him this was not a simple neighborhood dispute. This was personal. He began to dig not into George's life, but into Brenda's. A few hours of sifting through old, digitized newspapers revealed her father, a brilliant but disgraced engineer, who had died a decade ago in quiet obscurity. The articles painted a picture of a man who had staked his entire family fortune on a secret government project back in the late 1980s. The project, described in vague, classified terms, was meant to be the pinnacle of cryptographic security, an unbreakable digital vault that would safeguard sensitive national secrets. But the project had abruptly ended, and a key prototype, along with the funding attached to its recovery, had vanished. Brenda's father was blamed for the failure and died a ruined man, leaving his family with nothing. This was the true source of Brenda's rage. She didn't hate George for his flowers. She hated him because she had found a single, faint record of a young research assistant named George Miller who had worked on her father's team. She believed George had been the one who betrayed her father, the one who stole the prototype and the money, and then retreated to a quiet life of luxury disguised as simplicity. Her war with him was not about an HOA violation, it was about getting back what she believed was rightfully hers. With Brenda's motive now clear, Alex shifted his focus back to George's past. Using the information he had on the project, he combed through newly declassified government documents from that era. He found a single, tantalizing report mentioning the lost prototype, codenamed Orpheus, and the massive payout the government had been willing to offer for its retrieval. The document specified the prototype was built into an ornate, Victorian-era strongbox, a detail that sent a jolt through Alex's mind. It was an exact match for the object Brenda had photographed. The document also hinted that the prototype wasn't just a vault for data, but was designed to hold and protect a specific type of digital currency, an early, experimental version of what would one day become cryptocurrency. The value was never explicitly stated, but the report detailed a reward of $2 million for its safe return. Alex's fingers trembled as he read it. The mystery wasn't about a missing antique. It was about a missing $2 million digital fortune. George wasn't just a grandpa with a secret. He was a silent keeper of a Cold War fortune. Alex now knew that Brenda's obsession, while born from spite and envy, had stumbled upon a truth far more incredible than she could ever have imagined. He had the first major clue to the missing money, and he knew he had to get to the bottom of the story before Brenda's escalating actions cost George everything. He had to decide whether he was going to expose the secret or protect the old man from the firestorm he had unknowingly caused. Driven by his discovery, Alex, the young reporter, raced to his car, his mind a whirlwind of information. The truth was far more complex and tragic than a simple neighborhood dispute. George Miller wasn't a thief, but a fugitive, and Brenda's father wasn't a victim, but the architect of his own downfall. Alex had the documents, the names, and the dates that proved George's innocence, but he hesitated. He wanted to break the story, to expose the truth, but a part of him felt a profound sympathy for both the old man and the misguided woman. He decided to confront them, not as a journalist seeking a headline, but as a neutral party with all the facts. He drove to Maplewood Lane, parking a safe distance away from George's house, only to see Brenda already there. She was no longer clutching a clipboard. She was holding a heavy-duty bolt cutter and a small, framed photo of her late father. Her face was a mask of cold fury, a stark contrast to her perfectly manicured lawn. She had reached her breaking point. She was done with paperwork and complaints. She was going to cut through the fence, break into George's shed, and reclaim what she believed was her legacy. Just as she approached the gate, George stepped out onto his porch, not with fear in his eyes, but with a weary sadness. He had seen her coming. "Brenda," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's time you and I had a talk." Brenda dropped the bolt cutters, her eyes blazing with a mix of triumph and rage. "You're a coward, George, a thief. My father was a brilliant man, and you took everything from him. The money, his legacy, his life's work. You think your little petunia garden can hide a $2 million secret. I know what you have in there. I'm going to get back what you stole from my family, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what you did." She ranted, her voice cracking with years of built-up frustration and sorrow. Her father had told her George Miller was a turncoat, a traitor who had stolen a prototype and fled, leaving him to face the consequences. This story, a fiction born from her father's final, desperate act of self-preservation, had become Brenda's entire reality. George listened to her, his face softening with a deep, sorrowful empathy. He had watched her for years, seen her consumed by a bitterness he knew he was responsible for, but he could never tell her the truth. Until now. "I didn't steal from your father, Brenda," George said, his voice low and heavy. "I saved him. I saved the project. The prototype he built was a marvel, the most secure digital vault ever created. But he got into financial trouble. He was losing everything. In his desperation, he made a deal with the wrong people. He was going to sell the prototype to a foreign government. It was going to be used to access secure networks, to steal information. It wasn't about money, Brenda. It was about national security." Brenda's face went white. "You're lying," she whispered, her conviction wavering for the first time. "My father would never." "He would have," George interrupted gently. "I was his assistant, his friend. I looked up to him. But I saw the deal he made. I tried to talk him out of it, but he was too far gone. So, I took the prototype, not for myself, but to protect it. I ran. I became a ghost. The $2 million wasn't money I stole. It was a government reward for the safe return of the device. A reward they never had to pay because they lost track of me. Your father, in his final moments, couldn't face the truth of what he had done. He didn't betray me. He betrayed himself, and he lied to you to save his memory. The real hero of this story, the one who sacrificed everything, was not the man you think." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, folded letter. It was from her father, a final confession written to a friend, detailing his shame and George's loyalty. George handed it to her. Brenda took the letter, her hands shaking, and read the words that shattered her entire world. The man she had spent her life hating was a hero, and the father she had worshipped was the true villain. The $2 million was not a stolen fortune. It was the price of a life she could have had, a life built on a foundation of honesty and courage. Her campaign of vengeance, her entire identity, a rule-abiding woman fighting for justice, had been nothing more than a tragic, misguided lie. The confrontation was over. There was no victory, no defeat, only a devastating silence as Brenda stood there, the weight of the truth finally settling over her, not from the police, but from the man who had been a silent guardian of her family's honor all along. Alex, watching from his car, knew he had found his story, but it was a story he was no longer sure he had the right to tell. Brenda stood motionless on the pavement, the confession letter from her father crumpled in her hand. The words she had just read had not only rewritten her family's history, but had utterly shattered the reality she had built for herself. The anger, the righteousness, the bitter envy that had fueled her for years, it all evaporated, leaving a hollow, aching void. George, the man she had spent a decade antagonizing, wasn't a thief. He was a protector, a man who had risked his life to save her father's legacy from being sold to foreign power. He had borne her misplaced hatred silently, all to honor a man who didn't deserve it. A single tear traced a path down her cheek as she finally looked at George, truly looked at him, and saw not an enemy, but the quiet hero he was. Just then, a sleek black sedan, the same one Alex had noticed earlier, pulled silently to a stop in front of George's house. Two men in immaculate black suits stepped out, their faces stern and their movements precise. They were not local police or city officials. Their presence was authoritative, federal. They walked with a purpose that broke the suburban tranquility. One of them, a silver-haired man with an intense gaze, approached George. "George Miller," he asked, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Agent Thorne, National Security Division. We received a report flagged with your name. An old file, but a persistent one. We believe you may be in possession of a prototype codenamed Orpheus. We're here to retrieve it." The game was over. Brenda's desperate call and Agent Thorne's long-dormant alert had converged, finally exposing the secret George had guarded for 30 years. George simply nodded. There was no denial, no struggle. It was a moment, he had known, in the back of his mind, would one day arrive. He looked at Brenda, his expression pained. He had held onto the secret to protect her father's memory, to ensure she would never learn the terrible truth, but she had found it anyway. And now, because of her actions, he was finally forced to confront the past he had so painstakingly buried. "I'll get it," George said, his voice a low rumble. He turned and walked back into his house, the two agents following him without a word. Brenda watched, a terrified and ashamed spectator. Inside the house, George led them down a narrow set of stairs into his dusty, cluttered basement. He knelt and pulled back a heavy rug, revealing a hidden trapdoor. He lifted it to expose a small, airtight compartment he had built decades ago. From inside, he carefully pulled out the ornate, antique safe, the Orpheus prototype, and the small, black box with its blinking lights, which served as its power source and digital key. The agents immediately recognized the devices from their briefing photos. This wasn't just a prototype. It was an early form of a decentralized digital currency, an asset worth millions in its time, now reactivated and pulsing with life. The $2 million was a reward, not just for the device itself, but for the information it contained, information that could be used to replicate the technology. "You had it all this time," Agent Thorne said, his voice laced with grudging respect. "We assumed it was lost forever. Why didn't you turn it in? The reward would have changed your life." George held the device, a weight from another lifetime, in his hands. He looked at Brenda, who had come down to the foot of the stairs, her face pale with shock. "The reward wasn't just money," he said, his voice resonating through the silent basement. "It was a ticket back into a world of targets and threats. If I had turned it in, I would have had to give up my identity, my peace. I would have been living with a target on my back for the rest of my life. The money was a bribe, a way for them to force me to come out of hiding. I chose peace. I chose a life where a beautiful garden and good neighbors were worth more than any fortune." He placed the prototype on a workbench. "I couldn't bring myself to sell my life's tranquility, but more importantly, I couldn't expose the truth about her father." The agents packed the device into a specialized case. As they left, Brenda stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. She saw it all now. She saw the years of her misdirected hatred, the endless paperwork, the public feuds. It was all for nothing. Her petty, vindictive obsession had just cost the man who was a silent guardian of her father's honor a multi-million-dollar secret. She had called the cops on a grandpa for a simple gardening violation, and in doing so, had forced him to give up the $2 million reward that had been his quiet refuge for 3 decades. The money wasn't stolen, it was forfeited, not by accident, but by choice. The truth was not a headline. It was a profound and heartbreaking lesson in honor and sacrifice. The Karen who called the cops on Grandpa had truly lost something far more valuable than the money, a chance at a different life, one built not on bitterness, but on a shared understanding of grace.